On the cold, damp morning of April 5th, 1713, the city of Geneva awoke to a shocking discovery. In the dank, stone-walled cell of the city prison, Maurice de Marcet, a 45-year-old linen thief, was found hanging by a string from a peg on the wall. The day before, Marcet had been subjected to brutal torture. His body racked with pain, his mind driven to the brink. The guards had left him alone, and in the darkness, he had found the only escape he could. This was not an isolated incident. In the early 18th century, the city of Geneva, a bustling hub of trade and religion, was grappling with a dark and troubling trend: suicide. Despite its reputation as a wealthy and well-governed city, the act of taking one's own life was not limited to the poor or the marginalized. Even the affluent and the politically powerful were not immune. In the early years, it seemed that wealth and citizenship offered little protection against the despair that drove people to such drastic measures. Almost all the citizens and bourgeois who took their lives through 1750 were suffering from physical or mental illnesses. These maladies, it seemed, transcended social and economic boundaries, affecting both the rich and the poor. But the story of Geneva's suicides is not just about the wealthy and the sick. It is also about the natifs, the native-born residents who, despite their inferior status, rarely turned to suicide. The natifs were the backbone of the city's artisanal workforce, skilled in trades like watchmaking and textiles. They were industrious, hardworking, and generally assured of a decent living. Unlike foreigners and the poor, they had a sense of belonging and a community that supported them. This sense of stability, it seems, provided a buffer against the despair that drove others to take their lives. The natifs, however, were not without their grievances. Politically, they were second-class citizens, excluded from the most lucrative professions and subject to higher taxes. They were required to make a mandatory deposit upon marriage to ensure they wouldn't become a burden on the state. Despite these challenges, the natifs remained in Geneva, finding solace in their work and the community they had built. The poor, on the other hand, were overrepresented among the suicides. Prisoners, suspected witches, and domestic servants, often isolated and marginalized, were particularly vulnerable. 9 of the 41 recorded suicides through 1650 involved people who were either in prison or about to be arrested. The conditions in jail, the torture, and the social isolation were enough to drive even the most resilient to despair. But poverty alone was not the sole cause. For example, 2 20-year-old female servants drowned themselves in 1612 and 1619 not because of their poverty, but because of the accusations of pregnancy and theft. These were personal tragedies that pushed them over the edge. Similarly, Maurice Giron, a peasant, hanged himself after losing a pair of oxen, an event that disrupted his mental equilibrium and drove him to take his own life. The economic trends of the time did not seem to have a direct impact on the frequency of suicides. In the 1690s, Geneva suffered from a series of famines and economic crises, yet the number of suicides remained low. In 1693, when the cost of wheat skyrocketed by 150%, only one person, a woman from an affluent family, took her life. Her suicide was the result of delirium, not economic hardship. By the late 18th century, the landscape of suicide in Geneva had changed. The number of suicides increased, particularly among the middle and upper classes. The poor, while still overrepresented, comprised a smaller proportion of the suicides. The most dramatic growth occurred among the middle class, particularly among native artisans. The reasons for this shift are complex. Some suggest that the rise in suicides among the affluent was due to the shame and loss of prestige associated with financial failure. In a capitalistic society, the loss of money and status could be a crushing blow. Pierre Delors, a watch merchant, shot himself in 1771 after making arrangements with creditors for his impending bankruptcy. His family would have been comfortable, but the shame of failure was too much to bear. Others point to cultural changes, the erosion of traditional values, and the rise of individualism. Durkheim, a sociologist, argued that in a well-regulated society, each class had a clear set of aspirations and limits, which provided a sense of contentment and stability. In a capitalistic society, however, the lack of such moral regulation could lead to a sense of chaos and anomie, driving people to despair. As the city of Geneva continued to grapple with these changes, the story of its suicides remained a dark and complex tale, a reflection of the struggles and aspirations of its people. The hangman's knot, once a rare sight, became a haunting symbol of the city's inner turmoil. Durkheim, a famous sociologist, believed that society had lost its moral compass, leading to a state of chaos he called anomie. This was partly because of the rapid growth of capitalism, where people were constantly chasing money and material goods. This endless pursuit of wealth created a lot of frustration and despair, which Durkheim thought was one of the reasons why suicide rates were so high in his time. Historian Georges Maurois agrees that capitalism played a big role in increasing suicide rates in France and England during the 18th century. He points to two major financial disasters: the South Sea bubble in England and the Mississippi bubble in France. Both of these speculative ventures led to many people losing their savings, which was a major blow. Capitalism, with its focus on individual success and competition, made people feel more isolated and vulnerable. Governments at the time didn't have strong enough systems to protect people from financial ruin. In the 18th century, European thinkers like John Locke and Anne Robert Jacques Turgot were promoting the idea that it was okay to be rich, and that people who pursued wealth were good for the economy. Locke even argued that it was fair for some people to have a lot more money than others. Turgot, who was a financial advisor to the French king, wrote that people who wanted to get rich were useful to the state. He didn't talk about whether it was right or wrong to be rich. He just focused on the economic benefits. Voltaire, a famous writer and philosopher, was also very interested in making money. He invested in various businesses, including the African grain trade and lotteries. He saw wealth as a way to become independent and didn't feel bad about being rich. However, not everyone agreed with this view. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, another philosopher, believed that luxury and materialism were the root of many evils. Geneva, a city in Switzerland, went through a big transformation during the 18th century. It was once a place known for its religious values, but by the 1700s, it had become a bustling commercial center. The city's watchmaking industry was booming, and Geneva was also a major player in banking and finance. Many Genevans were getting rich through trade and investments, and they started to show off their wealth with fancy houses, carriages, and luxurious furnishings. However, not everyone benefited from this prosperity. While some people, like bankers and merchants, were doing very well, others, especially the poor, were struggling. The gap between the rich and the poor grew wider, and this created a lot of tension. Some people felt left behind and frustrated, which contributed to higher suicide rates. The financial system in Geneva was also very risky. People invested in all sorts of ventures, some of which were like gambling. One of the most popular investments was a type of annuity where people would bet on the lifespan of young girls. If the girl lived, the investor would get a return, but if she died, the investor lost everything. This was a way for the French government to get loans, but it was very risky for the investors. Despite the risks, many Genevans, including magistrates, pastors, and even artisans were eager to make money. They invested heavily in lotteries and other speculative schemes. This led to a consumer society where people from all social classes started to buy more and more luxury items. However, this materialism also created a sense of disappointment when people couldn't achieve their financial goals. In the late 18th century, the economic situation in Geneva took a turn for the worse. The French Revolution caused a financial crisis, and many Genevan banks collapsed. This led to a lot of bankruptcies and economic hardship. During this time, suicide rates in Geneva spiked, especially among watchmakers and people in other industries that were hit hard by the economic downturn. Durkheim believed that dramatic economic changes, whether good or bad, could lead to more suicides because they disrupted the social order. When people's lives changed suddenly, they felt lost and unsupported. This is why the economic crisis in Geneva, which brought both prosperity and hardship, contributed to the rise in suicides. People who had invested everything in risky ventures and lost it all were especially vulnerable. The watchmaking industry, which had been so successful, saw many of its workers take their own lives, possibly because they felt their livelihoods were threatened. The story of 18th-century Geneva shows how economic changes can have a big impact on people's mental health and well-being. When a society becomes too focused on material success, it can lead to a lot of stress and frustration, especially for those who don't benefit from the boom. This is a lesson that still applies today as we continue to grapple with the challenges of capitalism and the pursuit of wealth. In the 18th century, Geneva's watchmaking industry, known as La Fabrique, was a bustling hub of activity. For most of the century, things went well, but there were a few hiccups along the way. In 1766, for instance, France banned the import of watches and related products, causing a brief disruption. Then, in 1770, the city authorities made some concessions to the natifs, who were local artisans demanding better working conditions. However, this led to legal action against the leaders of the natifs, and many of them ended up moving to France to set up their own watchmaking businesses, competing directly with the Genevan watchmakers. Despite these setbacks, La Fabrique continued to thrive until 1785, when a major economic crisis hit. This crisis had a profound impact on the watchmaking industry, and it's no coincidence that the number of watchmakers who committed suicide increased sharply from that year onward. By 1785, many watchmakers found themselves in dire straits, struggling to make ends meet. Some of the watchmakers who took their own lives were affected by technological changes. For example, Abraham Delane, a young watchmaker, killed himself in 1785 because the new watchmaking techniques made his old skills obsolete. He had to start over, almost like a new apprentice, and the loss of income deeply upset him. Another watchmaker, Pierre d'Ambre, shot himself in 1787 because the parts he used to make for watches were no longer needed. He felt he was too old to learn a new trade and faced a future of poverty. While economic hardship was a significant factor, it's important to note that other issues, like depression and alcoholism, could also contribute to suicide. However, the sharp increase in suicides among watchmakers coinciding with the economic downturn suggests a strong link between the two. Losing a job can lead to a loss of self-esteem, stress, and social isolation, all of which can increase the risk of suicide. Interestingly, the watchmakers who committed suicide were not typically from the lowest ranks of the industry. The watchmaking industry was highly specialized, with about 40 different types of jobs. Women often held lower-paying roles, such as polishing and gilding, which were physically demanding and sometimes dangerous. Most of the watchmakers who took their lives were journeymen or master watchmakers, people who had invested years in their craft and had good prospects until the crisis hit. They found it particularly difficult to adapt to new roles or industries, leading to a sense of despair. In contrast, other sectors of La Fabrique, like jewelers and goldsmiths, fared better. These professions made up about 10% of the workforce, but only a few jewelers and goldsmiths committed suicide. This was partly because the French market was more open to jewelry than to watches, which meant these artisans faced less competition. The textile industry, particularly the production of indiennes, printed cotton fabrics, also tells a different story. By the 1780s, indiennes were a major part of Geneva's economy, employing around 2,000 people. However, when the French government banned the import of certain fabrics in 1785, the industry suffered. Despite this, very few textile workers committed suicide. Unlike watchmakers, many textile workers were unskilled and could easily switch to other types of work. They didn't have the same emotional and financial investment in their jobs, so they were less likely to feel despair when the industry declined. The service sector, which included merchants, attorneys, and magistrates, also saw variations in suicide rates. Merchants, who were once more likely to commit suicide, became less prominent in the later part of the century. This was because Geneva's merchants traded a wide variety of goods, not just watches and textiles. They were less affected by the economic crisis because they could diversify their business. For example, Geneva was a key hub for trade between the north and south of Europe, dealing in goods like sugar, tobacco, and textiles. This diversity helped protect them from the economic downturn. Overall, the economic crisis of 1785 had a profound impact on Geneva's watchmaking industry, leading to a significant increase in suicides among watchmakers. However, other sectors, like textiles and services, were affected differently. The ability to adapt and the level of investment in one's profession played a crucial role in how people coped with the economic changes. The number of suicides in Geneva increased dramatically after 1750, and this rise cut across all social classes and occupations. One notable exception was the watchmaking industry, which experienced a significant crisis. Watchmaking was the largest sector in Geneva, employing many skilled craftsmen, but it suffered greatly in the late 1700s. Most of these craftsmen were natifs, or citizens, and their struggles contributed to the rise in suicides. Despite this, the crisis in watchmaking alone cannot fully explain the high suicide rates in the last 2 decades of the 18th century. Many other sectors also saw suicide rates that matched the overall workforce, indicating that the problem was widespread. The economic crisis of the late 18th century was a significant factor, but it wasn't the only one. Poverty and financial troubles were only mentioned as reasons for suicide in about 1/6 of the cases. Even if we assume that all poor people who committed suicide did so because of poverty, that still leaves 60% of suicides unexplained. Most people who took their lives were not poor. In fact, the number of poor suicides actually decreased relative to others over the 18th century. Geneva's economy didn't change drastically from the 17th to the 18th century. It was still a guild-based economy where family connections were crucial for getting better jobs. Artisans, like those in the Passé-Montré ornamental braiding industry, saw their job opportunities decline, but this wasn't unique to the 18th century. Genevans faced similar economic crises in the late 1600s, yet they didn't commit suicide at the same rate. The political climate in Geneva was also turbulent. The ruling oligarchy, or small group of wealthy and powerful people, was afraid of democracy. They used military help from France, Bern, and Zurich to suppress democratic movements in 1738, 1766, and 1782. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a famous Genevan philosopher, wrote about the need for a social contract and equal rights which resonated with the lower classes. This led to the formation of two political groups: the Negaifs, who supported the old regime, and the Representants, who wanted a more democratic government. In 1782, the Representants, with support from the Natifs, a lower class of skilled workers, briefly took control of Geneva. However, the old oligarchy called for foreign military intervention, and the new government was quickly overthrown. The division between the upper and lower classes became even more bitter. In 1791, a new constitution was adopted, but it didn't give the Natifs and habitants, another lower class, the right to vote. Inspired by the French Revolution, these groups formed radical clubs and led an armed insurrection in 1792. The old regime was finally overthrown, and a new government was established. However, the radical left took control in 1794, leading to economic and social upheaval. By 1798, Geneva was incorporated into Napoleonic France, ending its independence. The political changes had a noticeable impact on suicide rates. After 1750, no group was immune to suicide. Citizens, who made up a large part of the population, committed suicide in numbers that matched their share of the population. The Natifs, who had rarely committed suicide before, saw a dramatic increase. Foreigners also committed suicide more often, but not out of proportion to their population. Habitants, who gained citizenship in 1792, committed suicide less frequently. The political upheaval of the 1780s and 1790s did not seem to significantly alter the suicide rates. The number of suicides among different groups remained roughly proportional to their population. The peak year for suicides was 1793, right after the fall of the old regime. This suggests that some former citizens may have taken their own lives due to the loss of their privileged status. However, the overall pattern shows that the rise in suicides was a complex issue, influenced by a mix of economic, social, and political factors. The year 1793 was a turning point in Geneva. More people took their own lives that year than in any other year during the early modern period. But why? If we look closely at who these people were and what led them to such drastic measures, we can start to piece together the puzzle. Many might think that the former citizens and bourgeois who lost their privileged status after the revolution would be the ones most devastated. However, the data shows something different. These groups made up just over a fifth of the suicides, which is almost exactly their share of the pre-revolutionary population. If the fall of the old regime had been so traumatic, you'd expect to see more of them ending their lives, but that wasn't the case. Instead, the people who made up almost half of the suicides were the former Natifs. These were the people who had long been denied full citizenship, but had finally achieved it with the new democratic republic. Along with the lesser citizens and the habitants, the Natifs were the primary beneficiaries of the new regime. They had fought for equality and now had it so. Why were they the ones committing suicide? Let's take a closer look at the 17 men who took their lives in 1793. Only 6 of them had been citizens or bourgeois before the revolution. This means that the majority of the suicides were from the groups that should have been the happiest with the new system. 8 of the suicides were former Natifs, and 1 was a former habitant. These were the people who had just gained citizenship and equal rights. When we examine their motives, things become even more intriguing. Most of these suicides were not driven by political despair. Only 3 out of the 17 appeared to have any political motivation. And even then, it was only partial. One of these, Jacques Mirabeau, a wealthy spice merchant, had been depressed for a long time. He might have been upset about the revolution in France, but his business partner didn't know of any other reason for his suicide. Another clear political suicide was that of Charles Dalloz, a Frenchman who was upset about the events in his own country. He was a revolutionary who became disillusioned with the Jacobin dictatorship and the Reign of Terror. His suicide note clearly showed his despair over the state of France, not Geneva. The most typical case was Noé Pellin, a watchmaker and former natif. He shot himself in the heart, driven by economic despair. Just the day before, his employer had closed his shop, leaving Pellin without work. Despite being a member of the club Fraternel des Révolutionnaires, Geneviève Pellin's suicide was about his financial situation, not politics. This pattern holds true for the entire early modern period. Out of all the recorded suicides, only 8 were clearly motivated by political events. 7 of these were men, and 1 was a woman. Most of these political suicides occurred between July 1782 and November 1793. One of the most striking cases was George Charles Boyne, a watchmaker who shot himself in the head. He left a note expressing his horror at the spread of modern philosophy and the atrocities of the French Revolution. In 1793, the typical person who committed suicide was a male watchmaker. A former natif, in his late 30s, married with minor children. These were people who were not on the margins of society, but were deeply integrated into it. They were the ones who were most affected by economic hardship, not political changes. Now, let's turn to the broader issue of gender and suicide in Geneva. Historically, men have killed themselves more frequently than women. This trend was particularly pronounced in Geneva from 1781 onwards, where men outnumbered women by more than 3 to 1 in suicides. This shift started in the late 1700s, and by the end of the period, men accounted for 44.2% of all male suicides, compared to 29.5% of female suicides. For the entire early modern period, why this gender gap? Sociologists have offered various Emile Durkheim, a famous sociologist, suggested that women's mental lives were less developed, making them more instinctive and less prone to suicide. However, this view is no longer accepted. More recent theories focus on social roles and expectations. Men are often expected to be strong, ambitious, and self-reliant. These expectations can lead to feelings of failure and isolation, making men more likely to turn to suicide when they feel overwhelmed. Another theory is that men are more prone to toxicomania, especially alcoholism, which increases the risk of suicide. In Geneva, the criminal investigations do mention some cases of alcoholism, but it's not a major factor in the gender gap. Only 16 suicides were linked to alcoholism, and all but 1 were men. This suggests that while alcohol might play a role, it's not the primary driver. Socioeconomic and political factors also explain why suicide became more of a male phenomenon in the late 1700s. While women could also face financial hardships, the data shows that men were more likely to cite financial concerns as a reason for suicide. For example, Antoinette Martin, a wealthy woman, took her life partly due to dissatisfaction with her financial status, but such cases were rare. Most people who committed suicide over financial issues were men, often from the working class. In the end, the data from 1793 and the broader trends in Geneva suggest that while political changes had some impact, economic hardship and social expectations played a much larger role in driving people to suicide. The revolution brought new freedoms, but it also brought new challenges, especially for those who were already struggling. The gender gap in suicides reflects the different social pressures and expectations placed on men and women, with men often bearing the brunt of financial and social stress. In early modern Geneva, the roles of men and women were sharply defined, and these roles played a crucial part in how financial difficulties and job losses affected their mental health. For men, their identity and self-worth were closely tied to their work. They were expected to be the primary breadwinners and providers for their families. This meant that when they faced job loss or financial struggles, they often felt a deep sense of failure and shame. Women, on the other hand, were generally seen as secondary earners, and their work was often considered supplementary to the family income. This difference in how work and identity were perceived had a significant impact on suicide rates. For instance, Pierre Dombre, an unemployed watchmaker, took his own life partly because the skills he had spent years learning became obsolete due to technological changes. The thought of retraining for a new job was too much for him to bear. While women also worked in the watchmaking industry, making up about 30% of the workforce. None of the women who committed suicide from 1785 onward were watchmakers. Women were more adaptable and willing to change their jobs as market conditions demanded. They did not identify as strongly with a particular profession, making job loss less traumatic for them. Another factor was the wage gap. Women were paid much less than men, often earning no more than half of what their male counterparts made for the same work. This lower expectation for earnings meant that financial hardship was less likely to drive women to suicide. In married households, the husband was expected to be the main provider, so men felt a greater sense of failure if they couldn't meet this expectation. This pressure was especially intense for married men with dependent children, who were more likely to commit suicide due to poverty. While financial concerns were a major factor, political instability also played a role. The Revolution of December 1792 and the economic crisis that followed created a lot of uncertainty. Men who were the political actors in Geneva felt the impact of these changes more acutely. Women, while affected by their husbands' and fathers' fortunes, did not have a political voice. They were largely excluded from the political sphere, which meant that political setbacks did not weigh as heavily on them. In the 18th century, Geneva had a system in place to prevent starvation. La Chambre des Blés, established in 1628, stockpiled grains and intervened during crises to ensure the population was fed. Despite occasional unrest over high bread prices, no one in Geneva died of hunger. People were generally well fed, with a diet that included more meat and less bread over time. However, even in a well-fed society, poverty could still lead to feelings of failure, especially for men who were expected to provide for their families. The social norms of the time were deeply rooted in patriarchy. Men had more opportunities to succeed, but also more reasons to feel like failures. Women's roles were more flexible, and they had lower expectations, which made them less likely to feel the same level of disappointment. This pattern is not unique to early modern Geneva. Sociological studies in the 20th century show similar trends where men's identity and social status are closely tied to their occupation, leading to higher suicide rates when they face job loss or financial difficulties. In the context of these social norms, it's important to understand why economic downturns and political unrest in the late 18th century led to a rise in suicides, particularly among men. While the materialism and economic crises of the time certainly played a role, they do not fully explain why these issues hadn't led to similar increases in suicides in earlier periods. Changes in mentality and the way people perceived their roles in society were also crucial factors. Men in the 18th century were more likely to see job loss and financial struggles as a personal failure, while women with their more flexible roles were better able to adapt to changing circumstances. In the bustling city of Geneva during the 1700s, life was a tapestry of intricate social and economic threads. The city was divided into different groups, each with its own status and privileges. At the top were the citizens and the bourgeoisie, who held the most power and wealth. Below them were the natives inhabitants, who, despite their lower status, played crucial roles in the city's economy and social fabric. The citizens and the bourgeoisie were the cream of the crop. They made up a small but influential part of the population. In the early 1700s, only about 11% of the people working in commerce and the liberal professions were citizens, while habitants and foreigners made up about 33%. By the 1770s, the numbers had shifted, with citizens and bourgeoisie comprising only 6.8% of this workforce, while habitants and foreigners accounted for 32.2%. This shows that even though the citizens were a minority, they still held significant economic power. The bourgeoisie, in particular, were deeply involved in commerce and the liberal professions. In the 1770s, about 41.4% of the bourgeoisie were engaged in these sectors, and another 46% worked in La Fabrique, which was a major manufacturing center. This indicates that the bourgeoisie were not just wealthy, but also actively involved in the city's economic activities. However, the economic landscape was not static. The number of poor people among the habitants increased over time. This was partly because the influx of wealthy merchants and artisans during the Second Refuge created an atypical group of habitants. Later, as immigration continued, the demographic shifted, bringing in more unskilled workers. This shift highlights the dynamic nature of Geneva's social structure and the challenges faced by different groups. Women, though excluded from political power, still had a place in the economic life of Geneva. The wives, daughters, and mothers of citizens enjoyed certain privileges, such as the right to permanent residency and support from the Republic if they fell into indigence. This economic security, coupled with the greater opportunities available to their male relatives, often meant that women from these families lived more comfortably than those from other groups. In the countryside surrounding Geneva, women often worked alongside their husbands in agriculture. Even in the city, women were not entirely confined to domestic roles. Widows, in particular, had more freedom to engage in work. One notable example is Elizabeth Bollaker, a widow who ran a successful gilding enterprise in the late 17th century. Her business acumen and wealth made her one of the prominent merchant capitalists of the time. Despite these opportunities, the majority of women in domestic service were from the lower classes. By the end of the 18th century, nearly 92.4% of those employed in domestic service were women. This reflects the limited options available to women from poorer backgrounds and their vulnerability in the workforce. The economic and social conditions of Geneva also influenced the rate of suicides. Among the well-off citizens and bourgeois, mental and physical illnesses were often cited as reasons for suicide. In contrast, among the poorer foreigners, the reasons were more varied, including illness, but also more immediate economic hardships. Interestingly, only a few cases of suicide were linked to political events, and these occurred during the tumultuous 1780s and 1790s. The economic landscape of Geneva was also shaped by external factors. For instance, the famines of the late 17th century, which caused significant increases in mortality and declines in population, had a profound impact on the city. The price of wheat nearly tripled in Anjou, a region of France, from 1691 to 1693, leading to widespread suffering. In Geneva, the city faced similar economic challenges, with periods of high prices and shortages affecting the population. Despite these hardships, Geneva remained a center of banking and investment. The city's financial institutions played a crucial role in the broader European economy. Women, particularly widows, were active investors, often putting their money into British securities. This financial activity was a testament to the economic resilience and adaptability of the Genevan people. The story of Geneva in the 1700s is a complex one, woven from the threads of social hierarchy, economic activity, and individual experiences. It is a story of wealth and poverty, of opportunity and struggle, and of the ways in which people navigated the challenges of their time. In the 18th century, Geneva, a bustling city in Switzerland, experienced significant changes in its social and economic fabric. These changes had profound effects on the lives of its inhabitants, influencing everything from their spending habits to their mental health, and even leading some to take their own lives. In the early part of the century, Geneva's leaders were deeply concerned about the moral implications of luxury. They passed strict laws, known as sumptuary laws, to control how people spent their money. For example, in 1626, the small and general councils banned gold or silver book clasps and any combination of gold or silver with silk. They also required that weddings and funerals be simple, and they set limits on the value of jewelry people could wear based on their wealth. These laws were rooted in religious values, reflecting the strong influence of Calvinism in Geneva. However, as the century progressed, these laws became less about morality and more about maintaining social order. By 1772, the laws were less critical of luxury, reflecting a shift in the city's values. The wealthy began to build large, beautiful townhouses, and even the less affluent started to invest more in valuable items like jewelry, silverware, and art. By the 1770s, these items made up 20% of the value of people's possessions, compared to just 6% in the 1730s. Despite this increasing wealth, financial struggles persisted. Many people, especially skilled workers and merchants, faced difficult economic conditions. The city's records show that debts were a common reason for suicide, especially among those who lost their jobs or businesses. For example, in the 1780s, a man named Conenworf, a skilled worker in the watchmaking industry, took his own life after complaining about not having enough work. This pattern was not unique to Geneva. In other parts of Europe, such as Prussia, financial difficulties were also a leading cause of suicide. The city's political climate also played a role. In the late 1780s, Geneva was undergoing significant social and political changes. The old ruling class, known as the citizens, saw their power challenged by a growing bourgeoisie or middle class. This tension led to a revolution in 1782, which temporarily disrupted the city's social order. During this period, the number of suicides did not decrease, contrary to what some sociologists believe happens during political crises. Instead, people continued to struggle with personal and financial issues, and some turned to suicide as a way to escape their problems. One notable case from this period was Jacques Mirabeau, a spice merchant who committed suicide in 1793. His post-mortem inventory revealed that he had a large library, including works by Rousseau, Voltaire, and Calvin, suggesting that he was well-read and engaged with the intellectual currents of his time. Despite his apparent wealth, Mirabeau's personal and financial troubles led him to take his own life. The story of Geneva in the 18th century is one of change and adaptation. The city's residents faced new economic opportunities and challenges, and their responses to these changes were complex. While some prospered, others struggled, and the social and economic pressures of the time had a significant impact on people's mental health and well-being. The history of Geneva during this period reminds us that the relationship between wealth, social status, and personal happiness is far from straightforward.